Imagine a world where one of the most influential voices for peace and love is silenced, not by natural causes, but by an obsessed fan. How could a man who spread messages of unity, who transformed music with the Beatles, and who envisioned a world living in harmony, meet such a violent end? What drove Mark David Chapman, a seemingly ordinary man, to gun down John Lennon in cold blood on a chilly December evening in New York City? The murder of John Lennon is not only one of the most tragic events in music history, but also a stark reflection of the complexity of obsession, celebrity, and mental health. This is the story of how one of the most famous men in the world, an icon of peace, was struck down by his own fan. We will unravel the sequence of events leading up to that fatal night on December 8, 1980, the life of Mark David Chapman, and the legacy Lennon left behind, which is still felt today. John Lennon was more than just a musician. He was a global icon. Born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, England, he co-founded the Beatles, one of the most influential and commercially successful bands in history. Together with Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, Lennon transformed popular music, creating albums that are still revered decades later. From hits like Hey Jude to experimental albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles' influence was unparalleled. However, it was after the Beatles disbanded in 1970 that Lennon's voice truly began to resonate with the global peace movement. His solo career was marked by songs like Imagine, 1971, which encapsulated his idealistic vision of a world without war or borders, where people lived in harmony. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, became leading figures in anti-war activism, staging public protests such as the famous bed-ins for peace. His outspoken views made him a target for controversy, but they also solidified his status as a symbol of love, peace, and rebellion against the establishment. Despite his fame, Lennon had largely withdrawn from the public eye in the mid-1970s, focusing on his family life. He only re-emerged in 1980, releasing the album Double Fantasy, which celebrated his love for Ono and his renewed optimism for the future. Tragically, just as Lennon seemed poised for a new chapter, his life was cut short. Mark David Chapman, the man responsible for Lennon's death, had a vastly different trajectory. Born in 1955, Chapman led a seemingly ordinary life. However, his childhood was marred by emotional turmoil and a deep sense of inadequacy. Chapman struggled with mental health issues throughout his life, and his obsession with celebrities began to grow in his teenage years. He had a history of low self-esteem and even contemplated suicide at various points. Chapman's relationship with John Lennon was complicated. He idolized Lennon for his music and activism, but as his own mental health deteriorated, this admiration turned into resentment. Chapman became enraged by what he perceived as Lennon's hypocrisy, particularly over Lennon's 1966 comment that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Despite this anger, Chapman's obsession with Lennon continued to deepen, and in the months leading up to the murder, he became fixated on the idea that killing Lennon would somehow bring him a sense of identity and significance. Chapman also found a disturbing parallel between his life and the protagonist of J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye. He began to view himself as Holden Caulfield, a character who despised phoniness in the world. In his mind, Lennon, who sang about peace while living a life of wealth and privilege, embodied that hypocrisy. Chapman later claimed that he believed killing Lennon would help him become somebody. His obsession grew so severe that he began to meticulously plan the assassination, traveling to New York with the sole intent of murdering Lennon. The day of John Lennon's murder began like any other. Lennon and Ono spent the day together in New York City, giving an interview and posing for photographs. Ironically, one of the most famous images from that day shows Lennon signing an autograph for none other than Mark David Chapman. Chapman had been lurking outside the Dakota, Lennon's residence, for most of the day, clutching a copy of Double Fantasy. When Lennon emerged, Chapman asked him for an autograph, and Lennon, ever gracious to his fans, obliged. Chapman later recalled feeling elated by the interaction, but his murderous intent remained unchanged. That evening, as Lennon and Ono returned to the Dakota after a recording session, Chapman was waiting. At approximately 10:50 p.m., Lennon walked past Chapman, heading toward the entrance. It was then that Chapman pulled out a .38 revolver and fired 5 shots, 4 of which struck Lennon in the back and shoulder. Lennon, bleeding profusely, staggered into the building before collapsing. Despite the efforts of emergency responders, he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Chapman, meanwhile, made no attempt to flee. Instead, he sat on the sidewalk, reading The Catcher in the Rye, awaiting the arrival of the police. He later explained that the book represented his own feelings of alienation and his justification for the murder. When officers arrived, Chapman was calm and compliant, telling them, "I just shot John Lennon." News of John Lennon's death spread rapidly, plunging fans around the globe into shock and grief. In New York, thousands of mourners gathered outside the Dakota, singing Lennon's songs and holding vigils. Across the world, radio stations played his music in tribute, and fans struggled to make sense of how such a senseless act of violence could take the life of a man who had dedicated much of his life to promoting peace. Yoko Ono, devastated by the loss of her husband, requested that no funeral be held, instead asking for 10 minutes of silence worldwide in Lennon's memory. On December 14, 1980, millions of people across the globe observed this moment of silence, reflecting the profound impact Lennon had made on the world. The crime left a profound cultural mark, especially because it highlighted the vulnerability of celebrities and how fame can attract dangerous individuals. Fans questioned how this had been allowed to happen and expressed anger at the lack of security surrounding one of the world's most famous men. Chapman's motives for killing Lennon were deeply rooted in his psychological struggles. Prior to the murder, Chapman had been grappling with a combination of delusions, feelings of inadequacy, and anger towards Lennon. He had previously worked in refugee camps and sought meaning in his life, but found himself increasingly adrift. His disillusionment with Lennon's lifestyle, someone who sang about peace and love while living in a luxury apartment, added fuel to his rage. Chapman would later describe how his identity became consumed by his fixation on Lennon and The Catcher in the Rye. In interviews from prison, Chapman expressed that he viewed the murder as a form of self-destruction, saying, "I felt that by killing John Lennon I would become somebody, and instead of that, I became a murderer, and murderers are not somebodies." His cold, calculated demeanor after the shooting, reading Salinger's novel as if waiting for his actions to make sense, adds a chilling layer to his crime. After his arrest, Chapman was charged with second-degree murder. He initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but later changed his plea to guilty, stating that God had instructed him to do so. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Over the years, Chapman has had multiple parole hearings, each of which has been denied. His continued imprisonment is a result of both the severity of his crime and the overwhelming opposition from Lennon's family, particularly Yoko Ono, who has consistently urged authorities to keep Chapman behind bars. Ono, fearing for her own safety and that of her children, has made it clear that she believes Chapman should never be released. Chapman has expressed remorse during his parole hearings, claiming that he regrets the pain he caused to Lennon's family and fans. However, his continued fascination with The Catcher in the Rye and his frequent religious references have raised concerns about his mental state. Each time he applies for parole, public outcry reaffirms the strong sentiment that Chapman should remain incarcerated for life. Lennon's timeless songs, particularly Imagine, have continued to serve as anthems for peace, unity, and human rights. His call for a world without borders, without conflict, remains a powerful message, as relevant today as it was in the 1970s. His ability to blend artistry with activism left an indelible mark on the world, transcending the music industry and impacting global culture at large. Lennon's music and message weren't just limited to anti-war movements. He was also an outspoken advocate for civil rights, environmentalism, and the fight against social inequality. His efforts to use his platform to promote change have made him a symbol for countless generations of activists who seek a better world. Lennon once famously said, "A dream you dream alone is only a dream. A dream you dream together is reality." His words continue to inspire individuals and movements around the globe, from environmental protests to human rights campaigns. The murder of John Lennon is often compared to other high-profile assassinations that left the world in collective shock, such as those of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Lennon's death felt like the shattering of an era of idealism, where the hopeful visions of the 1960s and 1970s collided with the harsh realities of a world where even its most peaceful figures were not immune to violence. For many, Lennon's murder exposed the darker side of celebrity culture, one where fame could turn deadly when admiration morphed into obsession. Fans were left grappling with the irony of a man who spent his life advocating for peace being taken by a senseless act of violence. The media frenzy that followed Lennon's murder reflected both the shock and deep sorrow felt around the world. Reporters scrambled to capture the emotions of his fans, and tributes poured in from artists, activists, and political figures alike. Paul McCartney, Lennon's former bandmate, was famously stunned by the news, describing it as a drag because of the inability to properly express his feelings in such a raw moment. John Lennon's murder didn't just leave a void in the world of music. It changed how society viewed public figures and raised important questions about fame, mental health, and security. His death forced a re-evaluation of how accessible celebrities were to the public, leading to increased security measures for high-profile individuals. The tragedy also fueled debates about gun control and the treatment of mental illness in the United States. Mark David Chapman's actions further ignited conversations about the nature of obsession and the psychological dangers that unchecked idolization of public figures can pose. Chapman's disturbing fascination with Lennon, despite being based on admiration at first, turned violent, illustrating how the thin line between fandom and delusion can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Following Lennon's death, Yoko Ono became the custodian of his legacy, ensuring that his message of peace and love lived on. She has continued to champion the causes that Lennon believed in, speaking out on issues such as gun control, peace activism, and social justice. Her work in the years after Lennon's death has been instrumental in keeping his voice alive. Even as the world moved further away from the idealism of the 1960s and 1970s, Ono also remained a fiercely protective figure, both of her husband's legacy and her family. She has been outspoken in her opposition to Mark David Chapman's repeated attempts for parole, stating that she continues to fear for her safety and that of her family. Each time Chapman applies for parole, Lennon's fans rally behind Ono, ensuring that his killer remains in prison. A reminder of the enduring anger and sadness that Lennon's murder left in its wake. John Lennon's sons, Julian and Sean, have also carried forward their father's artistic legacy. Both have pursued careers in music, though each has done so in their own unique way. Julian Lennon has been open about the pressure he felt growing up in the shadow of his father's fame, but has worked to carve out his own identity. Sean, born to Lennon and Ono in 1975, was only 5 years old when his father was murdered, but he has continued to honor his father's memory through his own artistic endeavors and activism. More than 4 decades after his death, John Lennon remains a beacon of hope, peace, and creative genius. His music continues to inspire, his activism resonates, and his vision of a better world, free from war, borders, and hatred, has been immortalized through his art and his actions. The murder of John Lennon shocked the world, revealing the darker side of fame and the fragility of life. But even in his tragic death, Lennon's message of peace transcended the horror of that December night. The irony of his violent end, juxtaposed with his lifelong advocacy for nonviolence, serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of the human experience. John Lennon once asked us to imagine a world where peace was possible, And while his life was cruelly taken from him, the legacy he left behind is a testament to the power of art and ideas. The question he posed, whether we can imagine a world of peace, still challenges us today, inviting future generations to dream and work for a better tomorrow. In the end, Lennon's vision of unity lives on, reminding us that while one man's life may have been cut short, his influence remains eternal.